How to make the Infinity Gauntlet by David J. Guyton at armortemplates.com. I wanted to make a more accurate version of this gauntlet. They changed the design pretty drastically before Infinity War was released, so the one I built before was pretty far from perfect. This one is as close as I can make to the movie version with a few liberties taken to make it wearable. This is a bit of an advanced build, so if you're doing yours in brass like I am, I suggest doing a couple of other builds of mine before you try this one. Somewhere hidden in this video is a secret link where you can download this template for free to build your own, so be on the lookout for that. And stay tuned to the end because we're going to find out if this thing can actually snap. Anyway, grab your hammers and let's get started. If you remember, I did this build before. This is a completely different build than last time though, so don't worry, it's a totally different process, totally different build. This is 18 gauge brass. I actually ordered 20 gauge brass, but somehow ended up with the wrong stuff, which made it a lot more difficult. I would suggest doing 20 gauge if you guys are trying to do this in brass. Here I've got part of the template. I'm just gluing this down to make sure that I've got some very accurate lines for this stuff. If you trace it out, it's not going to be nearly as accurate, so this is the best way to do it. Here I've got a power punch, and I'm basically just popping a couple holes in this thing so that I can get the jeweler's saw in here to make some cuts. If you've never used a jeweler's saw before, this is how it works. It's like a tiny hacksaw, but you can actually use the blade will free itself here at the bottom or top, and you can feed it into a hole and then tighten this up and make these little cuts. Now you're going to break a lot of these little blades, but it definitely makes this process doable. I don't know how else you do this without a laser cutter. Here I've got this stuff just kind of bulked out with the hole punch, the power punch, and just cleaning up the edges with a file. And I'm doing this piece last because it's so fragile. And then afterwards we can just peel this paper off and clean up these edges a little bit because they're a little imperfect. So file that away and you're done. Same goes for most of these decorative pieces on the front part. Here I've got an exhaust pipe in a vise, and I've got the knuckle plate. Ignore those holes there. And just basically beginning the bending process to get it to curve to the hand. Brass is a very stubborn metal. It doesn't like to be told what to do, so unlike steel, it takes a lot of work to get it to form to shape and stay there. Now I'm using my dishing stump and I'm just kind of rounding the edges out a bit at the front. Dishing form. And using the small end of the hammer, I can get a little bit tighter curves here. Here I'm fitting it to the hand. And now we've got to kind of flare these end pieces out a little bit away from the hand. And that's just a simple process here on the exhaust pipe. Now this part is sitting on top of this thing, as you can see, but it needs to be curved, just like the rest of it does. And you can basically do this by hand because these parts are pretty thin and frail. I've got some little brass tacks, little brass nails. These are basically just for show. They don't really do anything except for the two at the very ends here. But basically we're just going to cut those off and then hammer them down from the inside to make some little mock rivets. You've seen this process many times before. Now for these parts we're going to do some riveting with some brazing rod, bronze brazing rod. To prepare for that, we're going to make some holes that line up perfectly, and then we're going to use a countersink to countersink the holes. Here's some brass brazing rod, and we're just going to hammer this down until it's very flat. I used on the two sides I did this, and then just filed them away. And as you can see, they can't even be seen once you do that. So there's a lot of that in this build actually. Now these two top and bottom ones, I'm using that to rivet it to the knuckle plate itself, plus two more in these spots. And actually, I think I put 2 more at the bottom. I can't remember. And 1 at the top to hold it all together. And then, of course, file it all the way to make them completely flush. Now we can trim off these end pieces. And we'll be trimming out these center pieces where the infinity stones go as well. This is a piece of 3/32 brass tube, but as you can see, if you bend it too far, you will end up with a kink. Here's some brass brazing rod. This is what I use for most of the stuff. This is a piece of plain brass rod. As you can see, it all looks very similar. It's almost all identical. So this is a 3/32 brass tube. And I found that the best way to make these hard turns is to put a piece of 1/16 brazing rod inside of brass tube. And that allows you to make the bends without actually cracking the stuff. I made some little makeshift clamps here to hold this together. And you have to make this pretty exact to get this to conform and be soldered on. I just use some pliers and my hands to shape the thing. And then put them in position. Put some rosin paste on. I'm not going to call this stuff by name because I think YouTube is going to think that I'm cursing. Don't want that, because they'll demonetize my video. And now I've just got plain old electrical solder. The reason I use this stuff instead of silver solder you have to get a lot hotter, and this has to be very localized heat or else the parts are going to start coming off in other areas. So this was the best solution I could find for this. I did try using the brazing rod for this, but that did not work at all. You had to get that stuff very hot, and you start melting the brass, so it just didn't work out for me. Now I'm using a wire wheel on the Dremel to kind of get rid of a lot of that stuff that came through. And really, once you do that, it's almost invisible. You can't even see it. Here we've got some little wooden forms I've built. This is just for the two, there's 2 of each, and they go on top of the knuckle plate around the infinity stones. And I'm just basically using it to bend these pieces and get them in shape. As you can see, it kind of bends back. It doesn't like to stay in that shape, but some work afterwards makes it so that it stays like a little football shape here. And just use the form to check the size and shape. Once you do that, put some rosin paste down and then solder it on. This is the knuckle rider plate. As you can see, I have not cut out the little recesses in the back yet. I'm going to shape it first on the dishing stump and just curve these pieces with the teardrop hammer. This is a masonry chisel, and I've just set this thing up on a piece of exhaust pipe on a, I think that's a piece of foam I found, and I'm just going to whack it a couple times to give it a nice crease in each of these areas between the knuckles. And now I've got a piece from a dapping set inside a vise, and I'm going to round the edges even a little bit further to make it look like it does in the movie. Now I can cut out the recesses. These are in here so that they don't interfere with the lights that come in later on. And you'll see that later. Also, take a file, a very fine file, and do this to the edges wherever you beat on it, and you can get rid of those little bumps. It's a very easy process, and it's a perfect result. Now I'm just test fitting it. The ones on the end here are not brass, they are brass coated steel nails. They're a little bit tougher and a little bit more resilient and will hold up to all the motion. Now the hand plate will have to curve to the hand as well, but as with every other gauntlet build I've done, it's not a perfect straight line on both sides. It's a bit of an angle, and this will conform to your hand more accurately. Again, using a rawhide mallet to kind of convince it to do what I want. And there we go. It fits inside of this thing, or underneath of it anyway. And now, after I had soldered on a piece of brazing rod around the entire perimeter, I'm taking a Dremel tool and making the little, I guess, roping that you would see on a couple of these parts. And this was all done in this exact same manner for all of the parts that are adorned with that roping pattern. Now the van brace, this is a very big piece, so it's a lot of work. Like I said, it's very stubborn metal, so it takes a lot of time to get this thing to curve all the way around. But being persistent, it happens. The edges are a little bit harder to turn, so the rawhide mallet really helps with that. Now I'm marking some holes, and I'm going to rivet it together, although not to itself. I'm going to do the flush mount riveting, but I'm going to use a small strip of brass that will be riveted in from behind to rivet the two pieces of the van brace together. I'm filing away the rivets. And I had to make a couple tools for this. This is a, I think, fence pliers, fenceman's pliers, something like that. And I basically just took it and ground away part of it, as you can see there on the bottom. And then I welded in some from the top. And this will make sense in a second, guys, when you see the tool working. Okay, and that's kind of ugly, but we're going to file it away. Of course, that's very hard steel now that it's been welded, but a file will still cut into it. And basically you can see now that it fits inside of that little channel that I made before, but with enough space in between for a piece of metal. Now we're also going to cut off most of this stuff here. We don't need this metal, and it's going to be in the way. So these pieces need to be curved to the van brace. As you can see, they're flat right now, so they're not going to fit perfectly. So we're going to convince it with the rawhide mallet and a little bending by hand. And now you can see they fit against the van brace. Now you can see this tool in action. I'm basically just kind of going along the edges of it. And I'm doing 2 or 3 passes to keep it straight. But this thing just makes a little rolled edge, and it's just exactly what I needed, and it worked perfectly. Some of this stuff, though, especially on this piece, has to be done the old-fashioned way. So I have a blunted chisel and marked out some lines here, and I'm just going to kind of whack it with a hammer. And I'm using a piece of rubber underneath of it to give it something to bounce against. A piece of wood will work as well. As you can see, it's leaving me some little marks here. And I'm coming back with the same chisel, or a different chisel actually, on the underside to kind of give it a 3-dimensional effect. And it looks pretty good. This little inner van brace goes inside the main van brace, and it kind of pivots on these little hinges that or the rivets that we're going to put in later on. This is really the only moving part inside the van brace, unlike last time. And you have to, when you rivet this thing on, you have to kind of give a little clearance in this piece for the rivets that will be going in later on. So clearance that little part out, and you're good to go. Again, the roping. These little wing pieces I've got cut out, and I have some other pieces here that will fit behind it. and you have to make them fit pretty closely. I've got one little rivet, and we're going to solder in all around the edges here. The little decorative pieces all across the front and sides are made the same as the piece on the knuckle plate. You're going to turn green from all the brass dust, and don't even bother trying to keep your fingernails clean until this project is over. Here's some rivets that I've got holding this thing on. I assume you could solder it on as well, but I think this is easier. Now I'm using some of the bronze brazing rod to rivet all these pieces on. As you can see, the vambrace is not a circle, it's a little bit of different shape. And I've also got this little battery box I kind of put in here just to hold the battery and the switch. And I did that before I started putting these pieces on the front. As you can see, this piece kind of hangs over a bit. I'm not sure why they designed it that way, but it is what it is. The side decorations are held on with these little brass nails as rivets. Here's my cleared out section for the inner vambrace to rivet into, and now's the time to put that on with these little leather rivets. And then continue on putting the pieces on. This little notch at the top is to tell you where to put the pieces, so they're all in alignment. Cut these little rivets off, and the little tiny wings on the sides are to hide the rest of the rivets and tighten everything up. This is the thumb base, just kind of rounding it, and this little piece gets cut out, and all three of these pieces kind of rivet together just like that. Now I'm going to make a tool, another tool, to make the indents for the finger plates. I probably made it a little bit too wide, but it's pretty good. It's pretty close. Here are the pieces fit together. All four of these holes have perfect alignment. And then I welded in some rod from the back, so there's little pegs. Now we can weld in the center section after carefully aligning it. Weld that in, leaving some space for the metal to go. And now we can put a piece of brass in here and then put it in the vise, tighten it down, and it gives us that perfect uniform stamp. You're going to want to do this before you trace the pieces out though, because it's going to change the shape of your part if you don't. So now that you have that, make some little alignment marks so you know where to put this thing. Put it in here and then trace it out, then cut it, and here's what you've got. Now taking the seamer tool, just bend the parts over, and so on. And you may find you need to trim these pieces a little bit. You shouldn't have to trim them much. Here I've made a little, I guess you call this a mandrel. I think the mandrel is the right word for that. Anyway, you don't have to make this thing, but I did because I thought it would make my life a lot easier building this. But you can do this many different ways. I'm using a torch to heat the metal to make sure that it bends very well and it's being very compliant when it's very hot. If you're going to use a torch though, be very careful. If you're underage, make sure you have an adult do it for you. And that looks pretty good. Solder the edges and file the stuff away, and you got a pretty nice little fingertip here. The secret for making brass shiny is to hit it with a wire brush. And then olive oil afterwards. Don't forget to pop these holes here before you assemble all these parts together. These holes here, 1, 2, and 3 and 4, are where you will mount this to the glove later on. And there's a couple of holes here in the hand plate for the same thing. And the hand plate and the knuckle plate get riveted right here. That has to be done after though. This is hard to see, but in between here is a little 3/32 copper tube, and it's just basically a simple little spacer to keep these parts aligned properly. Test the parts, make sure they work properly. Here's how the thumb works. It's all just riveted together. Make sure those rivets are a little bit loose. Those are leather rivets I used. And the thumb tip is the same basic way. Now you're gonna have to put some leather strips. Leave the last rivets out, of course, because that will be riveted directly into the glove, as you see me doing right here. And now the fingers are all on there and working. However, you're gonna need to glue them down because they're gonna pop out of there a little bit. So I use some rubber cement to keep them in position. Here I've got the thumb base, and I'm just going to rivet that on directly to this piece. And that's all for the brass parts. So now we're going to make some gems. Here basically I just made these pieces out of clay, and I've painted them so that they have a nice shiny surface. It's oven baked clay, so it's a hardened clay now. And I made a little box, and of course we're going to tape up the box as well so none of this silicone can leak out. And I've got a 2-part silicone mold compound. Mix this stuff together and make sure there's no streaks in it, and you know you've mixed it long enough. And slowly pour this in around the parts to avoid air bubbles. These are iridescent glass pieces that I got from the hobby store, and I'm just crushing them up. I may be selling these to you guys. I'm not sure. It depends on the demand. If you see them on the website, they're for sale. If you don't, then they're not. Once you bust up the pieces, put them into the molds. And then I'm using a clear resin and 3 different colors, red, yellow, and blue will make all of the colors you need in different combinations. And you have to measure this stuff out extremely carefully, or else you're going to get milky, white, weird plastic that's not going to look good. Just a teeny little bit of dye goes a long way. Here I've mixed up the color in the A side, and then zeroed the scale, and then added the B side after. Mix that up very thoroughly. And again, carefully pour into the molds. Now if you don't care about air bubbles, you can leave it at that, but you're definitely going to get air bubbles no matter how careful you are if you just leave it at that. So I have a pressure pot, which is actually a paint tank, which I've converted. And I'm going to seal this up really tightly and then add air pressure to it using that little air tank in the back. And bring it up to 50 psi and let it sit for hours, several hours. And that crushes all the bubbles out of it, so that the bubbles are so small that you can't even see them. Once they come out of the mold, immediately paint them with polyurethane to protect and make them shiny. As you can see, they look really nice and magical. I mean, that's really neat. It looks like the real thing, huh? Anyway, the wiring is pretty simple. We're just going to put LED lights in here. I only ended up using 2 on the main stone, not 4. I used some super glue to put them in position, and then hot glue to lock them all down. But as you can see, you're going to see this light popping through here, so we have to do something about that. And I just took some vinyl, and it's like a vinyl sticker, and put it down all around this thing to kind of seal the lights in there so they don't bleed through. Now we're going to mount all these parts to the glove. We're going to mount the hand part first, and then afterwards we're going to mount the knuckle plate here. And also there's 2 rivets on the knuckle rider plate which hold this on, and then the van brace gets bolted on, or riveted on. And there you have it, guys. There you go. This is as accurate as I can make it. I really like this thing. Honestly, I know I say it all the time, but this is definitely the coolest thing I've ever built. And if you're wondering if it's for sale, no, it's not. This is definitely one of my personal items to go in my personal collection. Very proud of this thing, and hopefully you guys will be proud of yours too. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And ring that bell at the bottom, because if you don't ring the bell for some reason, YouTube does not give you any alerts. So make sure to do that. And now let's see if it snaps. Okay, this is completely unedited audio samples of the snap. So as you can see, it's not officially a snap, but it does make a snapping sound, which I'm pretty impressed by. I was not expecting that to be the case, and it's pretty cool.